Europe learns to carry a rifle. Why the once unthinkable idea of a European army now looks like overdue realism. For 7 decades Europe lived under an illusion so comfortable it passed for a law of nature, that history had moved on, war had been tamed, and security could be outsourced indefinitely. That illusion is now breaking. What follows is not a manifesto for militarism, but an autopsy of complacency, and a study of what strategic adulthood might finally require. The continent that forgot how to fear, Europe's post-war settlement produced prosperity, peace, and a peculiar kind of amnesia. After 1945, the continent's relationship with force was deliberately reshaped. Armies were reduced, borders sanctified, and violence moralized away as something that belonged to a darker past. Defense budgets shrank with every passing decade, strategic culture thinned out, uniforms became rarer in public life. Power, Europeans persuaded themselves, had been civilized. This transformation was not accidental. It rested on a bargain. The United States would underwrite European security, Europe would rebuild, integrate, and eventually prosper. The institutional expression of that bargain was NATO, an alliance that looked multilateral on paper but was unmistakably American in muscle and intent. For Europe, the arrangement was ideal. It was cheaper to rely on Washington than to rearm. Safer politically to outsource defense than to debate it at home. Over time, this bargain hardened into assumption. American protection was treated not as a strategic choice, but as a permanent condition, like geography or climate. The idea that Europe might one day have to defend itself seriously became faintly embarrassing, a relic of Gaullist nostalgia or Federalist fantasy. That era is ending. The American guarantee, stripped of mythology. The first serious crack in Europe's strategic confidence did not come from Moscow or Beijing, but from Washington itself. The rise, and political resilience, of Donald Trump did not merely offend European elites, it demystified American power. Trump's open skepticism toward alliances, his transactional view of security, pay up or else, and his casual willingness to question collective defense obligations exposed a truth Europeans had long preferred to ignore. American protection is political, not metaphysical. Even when Trump left office, the spell did not fully reform. Europeans understood that future American presidents, Democratic or Republican, might prioritize Asia, domestic renewal, or simple retrenchment. Europe, once the centerpiece of American strategy, now competes for attention with the Indo-Pacific, internal polarization and fiscal constraint. The shock was psychological rather than immediate. America did not withdraw its troops. NATO did not collapse. But certainty evaporated. Strategic planning cannot rest on nostalgia, and Europe slowly realized that it had been mistaking habit for destiny. Ukraine and the return of history. If Trump unsettled Europe's assumptions, Ukraine destroyed its illusions. Russia's full-scale invasion was not a gray zone operation or a frozen conflict, it was old-fashioned war. Tanks rolled across borders. Cities were leveled. Treaties proved fragile under artillery fire. Europe responded with unity and generosity. Sanctions were imposed at unprecedented scale. Financial aid flowed. Weapons were transferred. Yet beneath the moral clarity lay operational confusion. Ammunition stocks dwindled at alarming speed. Production lines proved slow, fragmented and national. Decision-making was cumbersome, split across capitals with differing thresholds for risk. Europe could fund a war. It could not fight one efficiently. The lesson was stark. A continent that cannot sustain high-intensity conflict in its own neighborhood is not a strategic actor. It is a sponsor, wealthy, earnest, and ultimately dependent. NATO's paradox, strength that breeds fragility. Talk of a European army is often misread as hostility toward NATO. In truth, it reflects anxiety about NATO's structure. The alliance works because America is powerful. But that very asymmetry creates vulnerability. If American commitment weakens, the entire edifice trembles. European strategists increasingly frame autonomy not as emancipation, but as insurance. A European force would not replace NATO, it would underpin it, providing redundancy in a system dangerously reliant on a single guarantor. Engineers understand this instinctively. Geopoliticians, belatedly, are catching up. This marks a subtle but profound shift. Europe is no longer asking how to remain indispensable to Washington. It is asking how to remain secure without Washington, if it must. Defense, rediscovered as industrial policy, Europe's military awakening has also been driven by something less lofty than strategy: economics. The continent spends substantial sums on defense but does so inefficiently. Dozens of weapons systems, incompatible logistics chains and overlapping procurement processes produce duplication without dominance. A common army implies common procurement. That means scale, standardization, and leverage. Fewer tank models. Interoperable ammunition. Production lines capable of surging in wartime rather than stalling in peacetime. It also means jobs, an argument that resonates far more with voters than abstract deterrence theory. In Brussels, defense has been repackaged as industrial strategy. Strategic autonomy is no longer a philosophical aspiration, it is a business plan. Eastern Europe, autonomy as anxiety. Nowhere are Europe's internal contradictions clearer than in its east. For policymakers in Paris or Brussels, a European army is an abstract governance problem. For Eastern Europe, it is existential. Geography disciplines theory. From Tallinn to Bucharest, strategic thinking is shaped less by white papers than by memory. Occupation, partition, and betrayal are not metaphors here, they are family histories. For these states, NATO's credibility has never been academic. It is the thin blue line between sovereignty and subjugation. This explains a paradox that often confounds Western Europeans. The countries most exposed to Russia are the least enthusiastic about European strategic autonomy. Not because they oppose Europe, but because they trust America more. Their fear is not of European weakness per se, but of European hesitation. They worry less about tanks than about timetables, less about manpower than about mandates. Would a European army respond quickly, or be paralyzed by debate? Would solidarity hold when costs are real? Thus, Eastern Europe's support for a European army is conditional. It must supplement, not substitute, the American guarantee. Anything that smells like decoupling is quietly resisted. The southern flank, instability without invasion. If Eastern Europe fears tanks, Southern Europe fears chaos. The threats from the Mediterranean are not armored divisions but collapsing states, militias, traffickers, and waves of desperate people. From the Sahel to Syria, Europe's southern neighborhood has become a zone of chronic instability. Weak governments, foreign interventions, and climate stress have produced conflicts that do not respect borders. Their consequences arrive not as invasions, but as migration flows, terrorism and political radicalization. Here, Europe's fragmented military posture has proved inadequate. Short-term missions and reluctant withdrawals have stabilized little. A European army, proponents argue, could finally align means with ambition, sustaining long-term deployments and integrating military and civilian tools, yet legitimacy is harder here than deterrence. European publics tolerate defensive postures more readily than distant interventions. Coffins returning from Mali provoke more controversy than battalions rotating through Poland. A European army would make intervention easier, but justification harder. Strategic overload. Taken together, Europe's eastern and southern challenges create a dilemma of overstretch. A European army must deter Russia, stabilize fragile neighbors, protect sea lanes and manage crises, often simultaneously. This requires prioritization, something Europe dislikes intensely. Strategic autonomy means admitting that some threats matter more than others, a conversation guaranteed to inflame regional sensitivities. Yet without it, autonomy collapses into slogan. A European army would therefore force Europe to develop a strategy worthy of the name. That alone would be revolutionary. Public opinion, shallow consent. Europe's leaders now speak more boldly about defense than their voters. Surveys show rising support for military spending and cooperation, but also deep ambivalence about the use of force. Europeans want security without war, deterrence without escalation, solidarity without sacrifice. This is not hypocrisy, it is the natural attitude of societies that have enjoyed peace for generations. War, for most Europeans, happens on screens. The danger is not opposition, but fragility. A European army requires consent that endures under pressure. When costs rise, casualties occur, and ambiguity sets in. That consent remains thin. The pacifist inheritance and the populist threat. Post-war Europe defined itself against militarism. This was morally necessary and politically stabilizing. But it left a residue, instinctive suspicion of force, even when defensive. Complicating matters further is populism. Across Europe, parties skeptical of integration question the legitimacy of supranational military power. A European army would be portrayed as elite overreach, technocratic militarism, or unwanted federalism. Any failure would be magnified. Public opinion, in short, is not a foundation. It is terrain to be contested. France, Germany, and the problem of command. France speaks the language of power fluently. Germany speaks the language of process. Both are indispensable, and mutually frustrating. Paris sees a European army as a multiplier of influence. Berlin views it through the lens of restraint and legitimacy. Smaller states fear domination by the big, larger ones fear paralysis by the many. Armies require hierarchy. Europe prefers consensus. Reconciling these instincts is the quiet revolution at the heart of the project. Nuclear shadows, hovering over the debate, is a question rarely voiced: nuclear deterrence. Europe's ultimate security guarantee remains American. France possesses its own nuclear force, but integrating it into a European framework raises questions that cut to the bone of sovereignty. Who decides? On whose behalf? Under what conditions? These questions are avoided not because they lack answers, but because their answers are uncomfortable. What autonomy really means. Strategic autonomy is often mistaken for independence. It is not. It is capacity, the capacity to act when others will not, to deter when words fail, and to choose restraint rather than have it imposed. Europe has power: economic, regulatory, demographic. What it lacks is coherence in extremis. A European army is an attempt, however halting, to correct that imbalance. Adulthood without illusion. Europe's debate over a European army is not about soldiers. It is about self-respect. For decades, Europe enjoyed the privileges of power without its burdens. That era is ending. The world has grown harsher. America less predictable. War has returned to Europe's doorstep. Fragmentation has become liability rather than luxury. A European army will not solve these problems. But refusing to confront them guarantees irrelevance. Strategic adulthood is rarely glamorous. It involves trade-offs, risk, and responsibility. Europe has postponed that reckoning for 70 years, it is postponing it no longer.